To get us started thinking about the next phase of this summit, where we're actually going to put you to work, we wanted to go back over the themes briefly. Again, just to remind you, we've got 5 themes: status of the current observing system, design and coordination, stakeholder perspectives on system design, support and funding, and data management. What we're going to do now is we're going to step through these 5 themes. We'll go over a brief synthesis of the white papers. Some of these are very mature. Henry Huntington did a beautiful synthesis of the stakeholder perspectives for us. Some of them are a little less mature. Martin and I are still hacking away at the design and coordination synthesis. Nonetheless, we will go through each of these, try to give you some highlights to start you thinking about what the current state of play is, where we see the findings and recommendations sitting. You can mull over that and discuss it at lunch. We'll come back from lunch and we'll actually start giving you instructions for the working groups. So Hai is going to start out with a synthesis of the status, and then we'll just work down the list.
Thank you. I'm Hayo Aiken, University of Alaska Fairbanks. I worked with Olivia Lee and Leif Andersson in summarizing the white papers that had a focus on the status of the observing system. In total, we considered about 20 white papers, all of them of I have to say, very good to outstanding quality. And I'm probably not going to be able to do justice to what's all in there. But I just wanted to give you a brief overview of a total of 6 or 7 sort of key points that emerge from these that I think help us inform some of the conversation at the summit here. So first of all, question is, how representative are those papers? SEAN has the inventory updated on existing observing systems, and Olivia Lee did a very nice detailed analysis of the various types of observations that are being done through that inventory. If you're interested in that, you can have a look at the white paper that the search program put together in the US that actually has more details and tables in there. But essentially, we feel that the submitted white papers actually reflect much of the breadth of ongoing programs, but there is a clear tendency to present white papers on very focused programs. One key thing that emerges, and in part that's by design, you've already heard mentioned, Henry Huntington summarized a number of excellent papers on community-based observations. There seems to be a gap between these community-driven or community-based observations and the more science question-driven observing networks. But given the people that we have in the room here, given some of the ideas that are put forward in the white papers, that gap can be closed. Potential ideas for discussion are that it may be worthwhile to examine how WMO-affiliated programs like Global Cryosphere Watch or the Polar Prediction Program or project can actually build on the expertise that is available in different Arctic communities through traditional local knowledge in improving predictions and assessments of the status, for example, of the cryosphere. One other aspect that we noticed was that private sector activities were not captured by any of the white papers. We're happy to have Paul Hultus here from the World Ocean Council. There's other representatives of the private sector and industry here, but that clearly is a major issue. And in particular, it's an issue, I mean, the comments about availability of data now are appreciated, but how do you learn more about what activities industry is actually planning to do? Knowing of activities in advance is an important issue to minimize duplication, to make the network lean and efficient. Second question then is, well, how do you prioritize or focus? There's various ways to do that. 3 sort of ways to think about focus are, first of all, of course, you have these consensus science questions that were alluded to earlier today. You have the concerns of the Arctic Council, which are driven mostly, if you look at the EPPR or even Sustainable Development Working Group, by hazards and emergency response. You have the broader issue of adaptation, and I really like Carolina Bea's summary of, well, how do you prioritize? Well, look at it through the lens of, say, food security or ecosystem services. Again, the question of how to phrase and identify indicators or indices that capture these types of concerns and allow us to prioritize That's something we can achieve at this meeting. Then the question of coordination. That's going to be a challenging one, but there's a lot of different ways to do that. Just looking at the white papers, two things that struck us were that the call for flagship observatories, Craig Tweedy had a white paper in with several others on flagship coastal observatories, but you can expand that. That seems to be one way to drive at least coordination at the regional level. And it's interesting that you look at some of these observatories, you look at TICSI and the Laptev Sea, that is an interesting flagship observatory where clearly there's engagement by Russian colleagues. Another important point, coordination in time, things like the Year of Polar Prediction may be interesting ways to achieve that. Regional distribution, there's a number of white papers that allow you to track activities. Bill Manley talked earlier. He and several others are involved with trying to map out these efforts. The EEA Eyes on Earth program is going to be quite interesting. What we're lacking are tools, quantitative tools, to actually guide design and optimization of observations in different areas. So that's something to think about a bit more. And also, in the regional context, the next summit needs to work hard to engage Russian participation. And this is not to say that we don't have implicit contributions by Russian colleagues that are embedded in the white papers, but really it'll be important to have a conversation at that in the run-up to the summit. Another bigger gap that may be not as critical in the context of this summit is that there were no white papers that are explicitly focused on remote sensing, linking remote sensing to surface-based observations. That's going to be an important point to discuss. And that may happen in the context of global programs such as GEOS. Martin Visbeck alluded to that earlier this morning. And finally, something that came up again and again, not only do we want to know what activities are underway, what's the inventory, how is that going to be updated, but then of course also how can you get access to the data, what is available in the form of data and information products. Clearly there is a need for this summit based on the white papers and what we've seen in discussions leading up to the summit to come up with some type of policy that this group here as a whole can buy into, that can really lead the way towards master directories and data co-management.
Okay, so this is the next sort of synthesis of on our batch of papers, which were actually as many as 28. So we had to do some collaboration and coordination and divide them up in two. Otherwise, it was more or less not doable. So I'll report on a few first, or the first 14 papers that fell into this category. It overlaps a lot with what Haya just reported here on the status. It, for example, is clearly seen that there is a heavy bias toward North America and the western part of the Eurasian Shelf region, Barents Sea and the Svalbard region. So I think the big challenge is the same as Haya said, that we need to get for example, the Russian community involved. And this gets even worse when you get out towards the Arctic Ocean, out on the shelf regions. It's a very heavy bias towards these areas. We are lacking a lot of information from several parts of the Arctic Ocean. It's simply blank. And this probably has to do with that we have problems with getting permission for a lot and to work in several economical zones in the Arctic, and I simply want to raise this for this community here. What will happen when we actually get the new Article 76 and the extension of continental shelf definition, which will extend all the way into the Arctic Ocean, and there will be no areas that are sort of free areas. From some respects, we have to remember that this concerns the seabed and below, but it will probably require another permit round for us to work in the high Arctic, etc. And I think that's a challenge. And I think as a community we can press on that. It should be easier to acquire permits. It should be easier to work specifically in the future, then, so we don't close up the Arctic more than it already is, because that's a big major blockage to observing systems in general. It's also clearly seen here, and I like what was said here from the director of CoPRID, that it might be an opportunity that there are so many overlaps, because it's clearly many overlaps in a lot of activities here, and it might open for a lot of new collaboration actually. So coordination is extremely important to discuss here, and lift up these overlaps. It could be a little bit sensitive sometimes to lift them up, but there are many overlaps, and we should see it as possibilities for coordination and collaboration. I do miss the whole concept of a spatial framework, and in that case, I mean, there are no papers except for a few dealing with the actual boundary conditions, how the Arctic look like. Because we need to put all these observations into a spatial framework. So we need to know, we need to have access to coastline information, we need to have access to accurate topography, bathymetry, and all these parameters that are actually a spatial framework. And I don't see that really in this context. I think we see sometimes observations as something that is running along and not really measuring also how the Earth looks like. It's parameters that are sort of coming and going. But I think we need to go back and think about the spatial framework as well. So I think that should be included in Arctic observation system. Otherwise, we cannot really put it in a context. And here comes this synthesized problem. We cannot just have measurements and not get together and synthesize them. There need to be products that people can use. Specifically in modeling, this is so important that we have all the different parameters synthesized in some way. And we heard how difficult it is to get to use them otherwise. I also think there is not enough discussion about platforms. There is more as a concept as a whole of Arctic observing system, but we probably need to go down to the basic here about discussing platforms and how we do some certain observations and how we coordinate platforms, etc. I saw some beautiful examples of coordination, and I might be on thin ice here, but I saw, for example, the paper on glass hydronet and the one on CAFFCBMP. They both are accessing the fresh water from one from the glacier system, the other one about biodiversity in freshwater systems in the Arctic, and both are about monitoring these systems. And I do think that there are some very good examples where might this community get together and benefit from their observations, and it might already happen. But I just thought that there could be a lot of really good opportunities within this community. So that was one example, and then I'll hand over to Craig to continue with the rest.
As Martin said, this was the largest body of papers that landed in the white paper collection, so we're still in the process of trying to synthesize results and pull things together. But a few more findings from the collected papers. This should come as no surprise to anybody that there was a clearly identified need in papers that specifically address this, and in many other papers that talked about the systems, for objective and quantitative approaches for design. This runs as a common thread through a lot of the material that we have in hand. The challenge here, of course, is that, as Martin and others alluded to earlier today, before you get to design and optimization, you need specification. Even within fairly mature pieces of the network, say the ocean community, which is the community that I come from, we have yet to lay down a careful specification of what's needed in terms of the observations. Until we have a quantitative specification like that, it's very hard to move on to a design optimization process because you don't really know what you're optimizing around. So that would be one of the things we pull out, is the need to start down that road of understanding what the specifications are for particular network components, and then to be able to step back and actually do the harder problem of how do you optimize across components, right? How do you make the trade-offs between very diverse elements of the network that are going after very different pieces? And if you want to take it one step further, we've talked about a creative tension between broad climate scale networks and community-based observing, and what local communities might need from the networks versus what a scientist doing decadal scale climate monitoring might need. How do you do the trade-offs between these things? Now, clearly there are ways to bridge these and create multi-purpose networks, but those have to be done intentionally and thoughtfully. There's a wide difference in readiness between different communities and different components of the network for undertaking this design process. Some communities have well-established modeling efforts, have well-established methodologies that they've borrowed from other elements to actually undertake a very quantitative design process. Others are using different methodologies to get at this, and all these things are effective. So the question is, how do you develop hybrid approaches, right? How do you modify these approaches so that you get a mix of very quantitative, say, model-driven design combined with local knowledge and regionally focused knowledge. The search white paper has a matrix that talks about different design stages that may be helpful to go back and look at. It's certainly one that the weed sat alone is being helpful, but take a look and see whether that is of any use. So the other thing drawn out of a number of different papers was the need for a scalable, sustainable network that's fairly agile, that's fairly adaptable. Right, this is a huge task. It requires broad coordination. You've heard that from multiple sources today, and here it is again. The need to maintain a persistent presence, right, which is difficult to do and is only done for some portions of the network at this point. The need to be able to make distributed observations, not just near areas where there's human habitation, but in areas of the Central Arctic and places that are much harder to get to. And to do all that at acceptable cost levels and acceptable risk levels. It's a pretty steep challenge, right? That's something that we're just starting to get to today of how do we address some of these pieces. We have platforms that drift on the ice now. We're getting better at making measurements in the upper part of the water column. We're not so good at making measurements in the atmospheric boundary layer in the Central Arctic autonomously. Right, that's still a fairly difficult problem that the various groups are tackling. There's a clear need to develop partnerships with existing international programs, WMO, others that have elements that we can use, they have things that we can tap. We need to build those ties. That's been identified within these papers. The idea of creating a living database of user requirements was an interesting one that was brought up by one of the papers. Something that grows with the network and with community needs, that's tracked, that has an evaluation protocol, that's continuously refreshed, that we go back and refer to make it easier to match community needs with the observing system and to evaluate whether or not those things are being served properly. To me, at least, when I read the white papers, I found that to be a fairly powerful idea and something that we maybe want to pursue over the next few days. A personal favorite for me, because this is where I work, is looking at autonomous approaches and technologies for making these observations. Martin made this point in his keynote talk, that really this is, in some sense, the only way that we're going to get the broadly distributed continuous presence we need. We do other things to bridge the gap, and those things won't be completely supplanted by the autonomous measurements. But if we really want to achieve this broadly distributed persistent presence, we're going to do that autonomously. There were a couple of papers on drifting observatories for the Central Arctic. Right now, these are seen to be a key component of being able to make a wide variety of measurements that we can't currently make autonomously. So we'll pursue those. It's also seen as a test bed for the autonomous approaches. There's more in those papers. Like I say, there are 28 of them where we're currently still desperately trying to get our arms around them and synthesize. But we'll move on to community-based monitoring now.
So, yeah, this is actually pretty complicated. Even, first of all, I'm pleased that we got 8 papers in and around this subject. And we also had some short statements, some of which I would have put kind of in stakeholder engagement, community-based monitoring. They really run the gamut, everything from sort of health surveillance to indigenous science, to psychology, to engaging local people in collecting observational data on sort of more typical physical and biological sciences. So it is difficult to sort of categorize these. Henry Huntington and I went through this, and so these are sort of a combination of our thoughts about what's present, what's absent. The papers run from very, very specific, detailed programs focused on collection of information on a small suite of variables or species or something like that, to much broader sort of theoretical papers discussing general principles and concepts. I would say that throughout all the papers, the common element is somehow a tie to Arctic communities, whether it's engagement of people in Arctic communities in their own observing activities, in scientific observing activities, or actually noticeably absent were any papers that actually talked about the collection of observational information on what people are doing in the Arctic, whether it's people in communities or whether it's all of the other things, like, for example, shipping. And we know that all of that information is out there, but it's not being pulled together in any comprehensive way. I have to put my glasses on here. Let's see where I'm going. Right, and one of the other things we found is that the topics and the findings, while complementary, don't necessarily overlap with one another or even reinforce one another. So we have a lot of very downscale, local kinds of observing activities with one or two exceptions. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we're trying to scale up and implement some community-based observing programs at a pan-Arctic scale for certain kinds of things, it does represent a challenge. And, you know, there are also some contradictory messages in these papers. So we have some that are really looking at ways we can engage technology, social media, to bring more people into collecting observational data, whether they've selected the data themselves or whether they're part of a scientific project, and others that are actually saying, no, this is not the way to go. We need to really be thinking about face-to-face communication at the very local level. And my feeling about that is it really depends on what the problem is you're trying to address and what the best approach is for addressing the problem. Right, so the key points that come out of all of these papers, if you put them together and you look at them, is that basically we have a lot of ideas out there. We have a lot of pilot projects that we've developed over the last decade or so, and we really need to now push these forward and put them into practice and really see what works and what doesn't work and actually start collecting the information that we need to be collected on a bigger scale. I just wanted to make a comment on geography since everybody else has talked about it. The contributions that we have are largely from Alaskan programs and programs in Canada, with some from Scandinavia. So again, we have a missing piece in the Russian Arctic. Everybody that is here today, I think, and it was really nicely illustrated by our panel discussion, recognizes that stakeholder perspectives are big. They run from people living in Arctic communities to oil and gas to shipping to people who live outside the Arctic. So community-based or stakeholder-engaged observing is, again, dictated by what group we're talking about and what it is they want to know. Having said that, it is very clear that effective monitoring or observational programs cannot take place in the Arctic without engagement of Arctic residents and without consideration of their priorities and their needs. And I was really pleased, actually, with the discussion at the end of the panel, where you got a real sense of how those priorities differ, or even whether or not people have priorities. They may be about methods, they may be about specific needs. And in order to really build an observing system that engages stakeholders, engages Arctic residents, and this point has been made several times, and it's very clear in these white papers, people have to be engaged from the very beginning, to defining the problem, defining and designing the observing system, to putting it in place, using the information, and distributing the information. Right, so what are some of the challenges? Basically, there are clear deficiencies in our current monitoring or observing efforts. There's a lack of baseline data, and it doesn't really matter what part of the system we're talking about. And even a basic understanding of various aspects of the Arctic system, including the way humans interact with the bio and the physical. Many of the existing data sets and data collections that we have are the result of years of prior work and are often data sets that were collected on the, based on ideas of what was important 10, 15, 20 years ago, and we may need actually totally different sets of data now. Monitoring priorities depend on the interests of the individual, the community, the stakeholder. I've already mentioned that, so I won't get into it together, but it is, I think, comes forward in all the papers that the broader the participation is, the more likely we are able to get a better integration. But this does then present a real challenge for us to understand why something may be a priority for Group A and not at all a priority for Group B, which means in the end we have to come to not just consensus but also probably compromise. So the main conclusions that we have basically from these papers that it really is time to ramp up these kinds of activities, to think about them not just at the local scale, but which ones may function at a pan-Arctic scale. Communities and stakeholders need to be fully engaged, and we really need to be thinking about how to use the information that comes out of community-based observing programs or stakeholder engagement in more scientific programs to understand the Arctic system and ultimately, and this was a take-home point in quite a few papers, do a better job in looking after it. So that's Peter, and I'm glad. Thanks.
So I looked at quite a few white papers with respect to what they are telling us about support and funding for Arctic observing activities. And there was no paper that really was focusing on that, but quite a few touched upon the issue. So what I did here is just collect a few statements that I extracted from reading these papers. Probably 20 or so, 20 plus out of the 48 did address the issue in one way or the other, sometimes just, you know, a note in passing, and collected a few of these statements just as, you know, starting point for discussion. One thing that came out fairly frequently was this problem of a mismatch between the timescales for funding and the timescale of the required time series that we are using to make a statement on the system behavior. Then there was I got a sense from what I was reading, but I also had that from my own observation, that there are not sufficient resources for operational observations. And what that really means is, you know, long-term observations that are backed by resources to do them, rather than having to apply every few years to extend the activity. There is, of course, by that mechanism of short-term proposals that support the activities, an uncertainty, an intrinsic uncertainty in support for established components, and that in itself can create a problem for spatial and temporal coverage of key variables. If some of these activities are not continue to be funded for whatever reasons, or if a proposal is not being extended for a key variable, then you might create gaps in your records that might hurt the entire observing system. There is a lack of international funding agreements, and we have discussed throughout this meeting that the task that we have at hand requires an international approach. But if you are doing international networking with strictly national funding, that sometimes really creates problems. And we all, a lot of us went through that when we had our work framed in an international content. You have international sort of planning meetings, et cetera, but you don't know who will be funded until it's almost too late. And if somebody is falling through in their funding, then an international program actually might suffer a setback because there is no time left for somebody else to come in. So the next point looks at the prioritization And priorities of system components that are required to address main science questions and stakeholder needs have to be set. So we did some of that in what I would call soft priority setting exercises. But I think as we are moving forward and as we are getting more data back that allow us to look at whether or not they really address the main science questions, we probably can refine the setting of priorities. But before we really do that, or as part of that exercise is an optimization of the observing system, and we have heard about that from previous speakers, that this is something that takes its time. It's not an easy task, especially in the case of the Arctic observing system, where you're going across domains. So you have opportunity cost if you're trying to compare observations in one compartment, let's say the atmosphere, with another one in let's say ecosystems or terrestrial systems. In terms of getting a good sense of where the international capacity for funding really is compared to what we think is needed, at some point I think we have to get to an estimate of the total cost for a long-term Arctic observing system. Now that of course is a number that has to be arrived at with a lot of consideration of what that means. But I think at some point we need it, and we have to keep in mind, if we arrive at that this is a number that will change as we are moving forward. But I think at some point it's needed for those who are asked to provide the funding so that they can really put it into the context of what is reasonably available. And I think it's also important for us to know where we are with our estimate compared to what funders tell us is a reasonable number. And that goes back then into the priority list. And then I think that something that has already been said is that we need mechanisms for international cost sharing for the Arctic observing system, because it is an exercise that has to be done in an international context. We have to do a lot of collaborative efforts, and in that context we have to find a way to cost share the effort in it, and that goes together with the statement that we have a lack of international agreements for funding. And when I talk about cost sharing, that is the reason that this point is coming up again here is that cost sharing can be direct movement of financial resources, but it also can be done in the context of providing access to platforms or use of platforms between nations. So as I said, these are just some initial points to stimulate your thoughts and stimulate discussion. There are certainly other items that can come into it, but it also, I want to re-emphasize, we have no dedicated effort in form of a white paper that tackles the funding issue as an issue in itself. This is all extracted from white papers that have a major focus on something other than funding. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got one last piece, and this is a synthesis of data management issues that Hanna Sagan put together. Hanna's not arriving until later this evening, so I'll go over a quick summary of what she pulled together. The first statement is fairly obvious. An Arctic observing system requires an overarching approach to data management. Right, there's a lot of data coming in. We have existing systems that cover individual networks, but as of yet have no real overarching system that either serves as a portal for the entire network or covers larger segments of it. So the existing systems, the questions that she's drawn out of the white papers are essentially what barriers exist to interoperability between systems, and to what degree can standardization be achieved. Right, we see some systems that cover certain segments or certain compartments of the network or certain elements, but But to what degree can we knit this all together to form a larger data portal, and what needs to be done to promote interoperability between those things? There was a question about whether the system should have an overarching data management body, and that's posed as a question within these papers that Hannah's drawn out. And if it did, what would its responsibilities and tasks be? And where would it derive support? There's a need to develop a uniform data access policy, both to promote access and to provide some sort of uniform expectation about how data would be served and how it would be available. Questions about what level that should be formulated at. There's appears to be a clear thread that the funding source, how the data are collected and who's funding that data, influences the level of access that is currently provided. There was an acknowledgement that there's a need to respect the current restrictions or inherent restrictions that come with the data. At the same time that there's a need to require open access, and perhaps open access after a well-defined embargo period or something that allows both of these two things to go hand in hand. Right? I mean, there are clearly conflicts in access and restrictions on data access right now that need to be resolved for the current network. One of the things that's come out in many of the white papers and discussions about data management are a need to establish a methodology for data tracking and attribution. One way to think about this is that one way we know whether or not we're measuring the right things is if the data are being taken up and used. And we have no uniform method of tracking that at the moment, but there is a clear need for understanding that to help understand whether or not we're measuring the right things. And then lastly, questions about how we go about developing these approaches, right? It's a large problem. We can't go after the whole thing at once. One of the things that's come out is maybe developing an approach by taking a subset of the data that sees a lot of use right now. There's some data sets that we know have a lot of traffic, right? Can we take those and develop use cases around them? Sort of develop best practices around those and then start to bring other things in once we understand what those best practices might be. There'll be plenty of time to talk about this more. We'll have one of the working groups focused on that. So before we break for lunch, just to give you a preview of where we're going with this, the workflow for the rest of the summit is going to take place in 5 working sessions. 1 and 2 are going to take place this afternoon. Working session 1 is going to prioritize findings, questions, and recommendations, drawn both from the white papers and the syntheses, but also from discussions within the working groups. The idea will be to identify a tractable subset of issues that we'll then take forward and develop into recommendations coming out of the summit. The second working group is going to look at issues that they deal with international collaboration and coordination of the system, and try to look at approaches for addressing those challenges. Oh. The third group is going to assess the fit of current observing activities with stakeholder needs and with current science and research questions, and look at the fit between the existing research questions and stakeholder needs. The fourth is going to take the results from those first 3 working groups and try to fold them into a new set of findings and recommendations for the summit. So essentially, we're going to take what you've seen talked about here and what exists in the census documents that are available to you and recast them into a set of findings and recommendations. And then the last working group is going to split itself between looking at near-term opportunities to move these things forward, try to take tractable examples of things that we can do and develop them into recommendations and a set of goals and pathways. And also a subset of it will take ideas for network specification and design and try to see how we can craft those for moving forward. So that's what we have in store for you. When you come back from lunch, Hayo will introduce charges. At 1:45. At 1:45, okay. So 1 hour for lunch, return at 1:45. We'll have, you have working group assignments. Those are available in the handouts and in the agendas that were passed out, but we'll go over them again when we come back through. what I'd like is for the people who've been identified as moderators and rapporteurs to come up to the stage here, and we'll have a little discussion before lunch. And then the last piece of this is that if you have a side meeting at lunch, or if you want to move into one of the breakout groups, feel free to grab your lunch and go. So you don't need to eat it there. You can take your lunch and move to wherever you need to work. Okay, so if I can get the reporters and moderators up here.